To Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest version, Chapter 3. As a note, this chapter contains racial slurs. It is in print. I will not be saying them. You can just take that back, boy. My fists were clenched and I was ready to let fly at Cecil Jacobs. Atticus had promised he would wear me out if he ever heard of me fighting anymore, but Cecil made me forget. He had announced in the schoolyard the day before that Scout Finch's daddy defended N-words. I denied it, but that evening I asked, "Do you defend N-words, Atticus?" "Of course I do. And don't say that, Scout. That's common. It's what everybody at school says. From now on, it'll be everybody less one." "Do all lawyers defend Negroes, Atticus?" "Of course they do, Scout." "Then why did Cecil make it sound like you were running a still?" Atticus sighed. "I'm simply defending a Negro named Tom Robinson. He lives in that little settlement beyond the town dump. He's a member of Cal's church, and she knows his family well. Scout, you aren't old enough to understand some things yet, but there's been some high talk around town to the effect that I shouldn't do much about defending this man. It's a peculiar case. It won't come to trial until summer session. Judge Taylor was kind enough to give us a postponement." "If you shouldn't be defending him, then why are you doing it?" "For a number of reasons," said Atticus. "The main one is, if I didn't, I couldn't hold up my head. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature." "Why not?" "Because I couldn't. Scout, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me. No matter what anybody says to you, you just hold your head high and keep those fists down." "Atticus, are we going to win the case?" "No, honey," Atticus said. "We were licked 100 years before we started. But that's no reason not to try to win." "You sound like Cousin Ike Finch," I said. Cousin Ike Finch was Macomb County's sole surviving Confederate veteran. "If I had to go through it again," he always said, "I'd walk every step of the way there and back." "Come here, Scout," Atticus said now. I crawled into his lap and tucked my head under his chin, and he put his arms around me and rocked me gently. "It's different this time," he said. "This time we aren't fighting the Yankees. We're fighting our friends. But remember this. No matter how bitter things get, they're still our friends, and this is still our home." Atticus so rarely asked Jim or me to do something for him that I decided I could nobly refrain from fighting for him. I remained noble for 3 weeks, until Christmas. Jim and I viewed Christmas with mixed feelings. The good side was our bachelor uncle, Jack Finch, who spent a week with us every Christmas time. The bad side was going to Finch's Landing to spend Christmas Day with Aunt Alexandra and Cousin Francis, her grandson. I suppose I should include Uncle Jimmy, Aunt Alexandra's husband, but as he never spoke a word to me in my life except to say, "Get off the fence," once, I never saw any reason to take notice of him. When Uncle Jack jumped down from the train at Macomb Junction, Christmas Eve, we had to wait for the porter to hand him 2 long packages. He shook hands with Jim and swung me high. "What's in those packages?" I asked him, pointing. "None of your business," he said. Jim said, "How's Rose Almer?" Rose Almer was Uncle Jack's beautiful yellow cat. He reached into his pocket and brought out some snapshots. "She's getting fat," he said. "She eats all the leftover fingers and ears from the hospital." "Oh, that's a damn story," I said. "I beg your pardon?" Atticus said, "Don't pay any attention, Jack. She's trying you out. Cal says she's been cussing fluently for a week now." Uncle Jack raised his eyebrows and said nothing, but at supper that evening, when I asked him to pass the damn ham, please, he pointed at me. "See me afterwards, young lady," he said. When supper was over, Uncle Jack went to the living room and sat down. He slapped his thighs for me to come sit on his lap. He pushed back my bangs and looked at me. "You're more like Atticus than your mother," he said. "You're also growing out of your pants a little. You like words like damn and hell now, don't you?" I said I reckoned so. "Well, I don't. Not unless there's extreme provocation connected with them. I'll be here a week, and I don't want to hear any words like that while I'm here, Scout. Now let's get to the tree." We decorated the tree until bedtime, and that night I dreamed of the 2 long packages for Jim and me. Next morning, Jim and I dived for them. They were what we had asked for: air rifles. Atticus declined to let us take them to the landing. I had already begun to think of shooting Francis, and said if we made one false move, he'd take them away from us for good. The house at Finch's Landing was white and two-storied, with porches circling it upstairs and downstairs. There was an old kitchen tacked onto the house by a wooden catwalk. At the landing, Jim felt his age and gravitated to the adults, leaving me to entertain our cousin Francis, who was 8 and slicked back his hair. "What'd you get for Christmas?" I asked politely. "Just what I asked for," he said. He had requested a pair of knee pants, a red leather booksack, 5 shirts, and an untied bow tie. Francis was the most boring child I had ever met. He managed to tell everything he knew about me to Aunt Alexandra, who in turn unburdened herself to Atticus, who either forgot it or gave me hell. But the only time I ever heard Atticus speak sharply to anyone was when I once heard him say, "Sister, I do the best I can with them." It had something to do with my going around in overalls. Aunt Alexandra's vision of my deportment involved playing with tea sets and wearing the Ada pearl necklace she gave me when I was born. Furthermore, I should be a ray of sunshine in my father's lonely life. Atticus said Aunt Alexandra didn't understand girls. But Aunt Alexandra's cooking made up for everything. For Christmas dinner, we had 3 kinds of meat, summer vegetables from her pantry shelves, peach pickles, 2 kinds of cake, and ambrosia. Afterward, the adults sat around in a dazed condition. Jim lay on the floor, and I sat on the back steps with Francis. "Grandma's going to teach me how to cook," he said. "Grandma says all men should learn to cook and wait on their wives when they don't feel good." "I don't want Dill waiting on me. I'd rather wait on him. Dill and I are going to get married as soon as we're big enough." Francis hooted. "You mean that little runt Grandma says stays with Miss Rachel every summer? Grandma says he hasn't got a home, just gets passed around from relative to relative. Well, if Uncle Atticus lets you run around with stray dogs, like Grandma says, it ain't your fault. I guess it ain't your fault either if Uncle Atticus is defending that Tom Robinson. But I tell you, it certainly does mortify the rest of the family." "Just what do you mean?" "Grandma says we'll never be able to walk the streets of Maycomb again." Francis rose and sprinted down the catwalk to the old kitchen. Safely there, he called, "He's nothing but an in-lover." I ran down the catwalk and collared him. This time, I split my knuckle to the bone on his front teeth. Then I sailed in with my right, but not for long. Uncle Jack pinned my arms to my sides and said, "Stand still. Who started this?" Francis and I pointed at each other. "Grandma," he bawled, "she jumped on me." Uncle Jack looked down at me. "You're in trouble, Scout," he said. "I hate you, and I hope you die tomorrow." This statement seemed to encourage Uncle Jack more than anything. I tore loose and ran to Atticus for comfort, but he said I had it coming, and it was high time we went home. I climbed into the car without saying goodbye, and at home I ran to my room and slammed the door. Uncle Jack knocked on the door and called my name. "Go away." Uncle Jack said if I talked like that, he'd give me a licking. He entered the room, and I retreated to a corner. "Scout," he said, "you had that coming, and you know it." "Didn't either. You ain't fair." Uncle Jack sat down on the bed. His eyebrows came together. "What was your side of it, Scout?" Francis called Atticus an in-lover. Said Atticus would be the ruination of the family. From the look on Uncle Jack's face, I knew Francis was in for it. "But you promise you won't tell Atticus. Please, Uncle Jack. He asked me not to let anything I heard about him make me mad." "And Uncle Jack, could you tie up my hand?" "Of course I will, baby. I know of no hand I'd be more delighted to tie up." Uncle Jack gallantly bowed me to the bathroom and bandaged my knuckles. "There now," he said, "you'll have a very unladylike scar on your wedding ring finger." Later, when I was supposed to be in bed, I went down the hall for a drink of water and heard Uncle Jack in the living room saying, "I shall never marry, Atticus. I might have children. Atticus, I'm sorry I've romped on your daughter." Atticus chuckled. "She earned it. Scout's got to learn to keep her head. What bothers me is that she and Jim will have to absorb some ugly things pretty soon." Atticus, how bad is this going to be? It couldn't be worse, Jack. The only thing we've got is a black man's word against the Ewells. What are you going to do then? Before I'm through, I intend to jar the jury a bit, and I think we'll have a reasonable chance on appeal. I hope and pray I can get Jim and Scout through all this without bitterness and without catching Macomb's usual disease. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad when anything involving a Negro comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. Jean Louise, my scalp jumped. I stuck my head around the corner. Sir? Go to bed. I scurried to my room, and I never figured out how Atticus knew I was listening. It was not until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word he said. Atticus was feeble. He was nearly 50, much older than the parents of our school contemporaries. When Jim and I asked him why he was so old, he said he got started late. What's more, Atticus didn't do anything. He did not drive a dump truck. He was not the sheriff. He did not farm, work in a garage, or do anything that could possibly arouse the admiration of anyone. He did not play poker, or fish, or drink, or smoke. He sat in the living room and read. I sounded out Calpurnia on the subject. Mr. Finch? Why, you can do lots of things. Like what? I asked. Calpurnia scratched her head. Well, I don't rightly know, she said. Atticus never even went hunting. He said he wasn't interested in guns. And when we got our air rifles for Christmas, Atticus left our instruction in shooting to Uncle Jack. One day, Atticus said to Jim, I'd rather you shot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want, if you can hit 'em. But remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. That was the only time I ever heard Atticus say it was a sin to do something, and I asked Miss Maudie about it. Your father is right, she said. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us. They don't eat up people's gardens or nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. One Saturday, Jim and I decided to go exploring with our air rifles to see if we could find a rabbit or a squirrel. We had gone about 500 yards beyond the Radley place when I noticed Jim squinting at something down the street. What you looking at? That old dog down yonder, he said. Old Tim Johnson. Tim Johnson was the property of Mr. Harry Johnson, who drove the Mobile bus. He was a brown and white bird dog, the pet of Macomb. What's he doing? I don't know, Scout. We better go home. Back home, Jim ran to Cal. Come on out a minute, he said. There's something wrong with the old dog down yonder. He's doing like this. Jim gulped like a goldfish, hunched his shoulders, and twitched his torso. He's going like that, only not like he means to. Was he running? No, he was just moseying along, coming this way. Calpurnia rinsed her hands and followed us out beyond the Radley place. Tim Johnson was closer now. He walked erratically, as if his right legs were shorter than his left legs. He's gone lopsided, said Jim. Calpurnia stared, then grabbed us by the shoulders and ran us home. She shut the wood door behind us, went to the telephone, and shouted, Give me Mr. Finch's office. Mr. Finch, she shouted, this is Cal. There's a mad dog down the street a piece. It's old Tim Johnson. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. She hung up, rattled the telephone hook, and said, Miss Eula May, can you call Miss Rachel and Miss Stephanie Crawford and whoever's got a phone on this street and tell them a mad dog's coming? Please, ma'am, hurry. Calpurnia's message was quickly received. While we watched, every door within our range of vision was closed tight, and a few moments later, a black Ford swung into our driveway. Atticus and Mr. Heck Tate got out. Mr. Heck Tate was the sheriff of Macomb County. He was as tall as Atticus, but thinner. His belt had a row of bullets sticking in it. He carried a heavy rifle. When they reached the porch, Jim opened the door. Stay inside, son, Atticus said. Where is he, Cal? Oh, he ought to be here by now, said Cal, pointing down the street. He's not running. He's in the twitching stage, sir. Should we go after him, Heck? Asked Atticus. We better wait, Mr. Finch. They'll usually go in a straight line, but you never can tell. Let's wait a minute. Nothing is more deadly than a deserted, waiting street. The trees were still, The mockingbirds were silent. The carpenters at Miss Maudie's new house had vanished. I saw Mr. Tate shift his gun to the crook of his arm. I saw Miss Stephanie Crawford's face framed in the glass window of her front door. "There he is," Atticus said softly. Tim Johnson came into sight, walking dazedly in the inner rim of the curve parallel to the Radley house. "He's got it all right, Mr. Finch," Mr. Tate said. Tim Johnson was advancing at a snail's pace, motivated by an invisible force that was inching him toward us. We could see him shiver like a horse shedding flies. His jaw opened and shut. "He's looking for a place to die," said Jim. Mr. Tate turned around. "He's far from dead, Jim." Tim Johnson reached the side street by the Radley place, and what remained of his poor mind made him pause and seem to consider which road he would take. He stopped in front of the Radley gate. Then he tried to turn around, but was having difficulty. Atticus said, "He's within range, Heck. You better get him now." Calpurnia tried to block Jim and me with her body, but we looked out from beneath her arms. "Take him, Mr. Finch. This is a one-shot job." Mr. Tate handed the rifle to Atticus. Jim and I nearly fainted. Atticus shook his head vehemently. "Mr. Finch, miss, and it'll go straight into the Radley house. I can't shoot that well, and you know it." "I haven't shot a gun in 30 years. Mr. Tate almost threw the rifle at Atticus. "I'd feel mighty comfortable if you did now," he said. In a fog, Jim and I watched our father take the gun and walk out into the middle of the street. Time slowed to a nauseating crawl while he raised his glasses, and Calpurnia murmured, "Sweet Jesus, help him," and put her hands to her cheeks. His glasses slipped down from his forehead, and he dropped them in the street. In the silence, I heard them crack. In front of the Radley gate, Tim Johnson had finally turned himself around to pursue his original course up our street. He stopped and raised his head. With movements so swift they seemed simultaneous, Atticus brought the gun to his shoulder and fired. The rifle cracked. Tim Johnson leaped, flopped over, and crumpled on the sidewalk in a brown and white heap. He didn't know what hit him. Mr. Tate jumped off the porch and ran and squatted in front of the dog. He turned and tapped his finger above his left eye. "You were a little to the right, Mr. Finch," he called. "Always was," Atticus answered. "If I had my druthers, I'd take a shotgun." He stooped, picked up his glasses, and ground the broken lenses to powder under his heel. Doors opened one by one, and the neighborhood slowly came alive. When Mr. Tate and Atticus returned to the yard, Mr. Tate was smiling. "I'll have Zebo collect him," he said. Zebo was Calpurnia's son, the refuse collector. "You haven't forgot much, Mr. Finch. They say it never leaves you." Atticus was silent. "I saw that one-shot, Finch." Atticus wheeled around and faced Miss Maudie. They looked at one another without saying anything, and then Atticus got into Mr. Tate's car. He said to Jim, "Don't you go near that dog. He's just as dangerous dead as alive. Now, Heck, let's go back to town." Miss Maudie was grinning at us. "You didn't know Atticus Finch was the deadest shot in Macomb County in his time. Nickname was Old One Shot when he was a boy. If he shot 15 times and hit 14 doves, he'd complain about wasting ammunition." Jim seemed paralyzed. "Wonder why he never goes hunting now," I said. "Maybe I can tell you," said Miss Maudie. "If your father's anything, he's civilized in his heart. Marksmanship's a gift from God. Oh, you have to practice, but shooting's different from playing the piano or the like. I think maybe he put his gun down when he realized that God had given him an unfair advantage over most living things." "Looks like he'd be proud of it," I said. "People in their right minds never take pride in their talents," Miss Maudie said.